Hello everybody, welcome to number 27. I'm Jack and today I'm going to talk to you about three incredible cars that you or I could probably afford to buy, but that would no doubt end up bankrupting us. There's a V8, there's a V10 and there is a V12. On top of that, at the end there's a bonus 2 extra cars. These are some of the most expensive in the world. I have some examples of the maintenance costs for these. Just to give you a taster, one of them had a bill for over £1 million. For just £14,000, you could buy yourself an incredible BMW E60 M5. This was BMW's first and I think only V10. It's a Formula One inspired supercar engine. It's a naturally aspirated 5-litre V10 which produces 500 horsepower at an absolutely euphoric 7,700 RPM. It had a top speed of 205 miles an hour with the limiter removed. 0 to 60, 4.2 seconds. It had a discreet yet muscular body, and it was a very practical car. It sounds too good to be true, and it is. So first of all, actual run-in costs were pretty monumental, and that is simply because the fuel consumption on this car is eye-watering. Official figures are about 17 miles to the gallon combined, but real world shows that most owners get 10 to 12 miles to the gallon when driving pretty ordinarily. Then, this was the era when BMW stopped making cars properly. So these cars weren't very well built. The interiors used quite low-grade materials, the leathers weren't very good quality, so they get baggy quite early on. They suffered from a host of electrical gremlins, so the iDrive unit can become unresponsive, it can fail altogether. There are issues with the SMG pump for the gear change. That can be quite costly to put right. Pre-2007 cars suffered from this. If it fails, could cost up to £3,000 to put right. But perhaps worst of all is a tendency for this engine with the big end bearings to spin, potentially causing £10,000 worth of damage and catastrophic failure. Now this is still obviously an absolutely fantastic sports car, but you're going to have to weigh up the risks before you decide whether you want to buy one or not. A very different car, but a really interesting one. For just £12,000 you could get yourself a Bentley Continental GT. This was the first of the new generation Bentleys completely designed under VW's ownership. As such, they were absolutely determined to come out with a groundbreaking car. And they really did. This first generation of modern Bentleys really hit the ball out of the park. 4-wheel drive, V12, an opulent interior, a 200 mile an hour top speed, and yet it cost about half the price of the older generation Bentleys that preceded it. As a result, it sold an awful lot. You really can find many of these under 20,000, starting at around 10 or 12 for cars that obviously have issues, to cars around 14 to 15 to 16,000 that seem good, but I'm sure hide an awful lot of issues. Now these cars are actually pretty reliable. The main problem with them is that they are very complex cars and they've become incredibly cheap. As such, the current owners won't be able to afford to do the full amount of servicing. If you buy one of these, you will then likely, if you buy it, especially a cheaper one, you'll almost certainly be lumbered with a whole host of issues and gremlins that you will have to attend to, and that can be expensive. The headline item is without doubt a blown head gasket. Now most normal cars, you have a blown head gasket, you take the head off, you get it skimmed, new gasket, usually between £1,500, £3,000, and you can get it fixed. Not on this Bentley. If you get a blown head gasket, the only solution is to replace the whole engine. VW, i.e. Bentley, do not supply head gaskets for these. So if it blows, you either have to find yourself a second-hand one or a new one. I think if you go new, you're looking at about £15,000 for this. Now, in such a complicated car, there are many things that go wrong, but I'm going to give you a few more highlights. If the heated rear screen fails, or the heater in the rear screen, that will be £2,500, please. The high-level brake light behind the rear screen, if that fails, that would be an MOT failure, and if that goes, £900 to fix that, because that is a screen-out job. Perhaps one of the most frustrating of all the problems that the Bentley suffers from, though, is a split vacuum hose. I think all cars pre-2007 suffer from this. And essentially, normally it wouldn't be an issue because it's a vacuum hose, you get to the hose, take it off and replace it. But in the GT, this vacuum hose goes over the top of the gearbox. It's made of plastic and eventually, with the heat cycles, it obviously splits. Once it does, the only solution to get to it is you have to remove the gearbox and then replace the vacuum line. Cost for that? About £4,000. The TPS sensor is quite a common thing on most cars, but if you go to Bentley with one of these, having them all replaced, the batteries go every 5 years, can be up to £800. And lastly, the sort of icing on the cake is that they tend to suffer from water ingress in the passenger footwell. Some of the electronics are housed under there, and if you get a substantial leak and you don't deal with it, that can end up costing you up to £15,000. To be honest, since I've been doing this feature and I've been looking at these, I've been extremely tempted myself, and I still wouldn't completely put this out of the question. It's just such a risk though, because I know that so many things could go wrong, but what an opportunity to own an absolutely luxurious, fantastic car for not that much money. The third car is a particular bugbear of mine. You might have seen a video I've done previously about this car in which I said how much I hate it. But a lot of people absolutely love them. Arguably, it's the car, or one of the cars, that saved Porsche. It is the KN. It is Porsche's first SUV. It was pretty revolutionary in many ways. It was good off-road. The turbo, 0 to 60, 5.2 seconds. It wasn't a pretty car, but it sold like hotcakes. It saved Porsche, and it was part of that new wave of SUVs that lead to what we have today. And now you can buy one for just £5,000 a turbo starts for. That is an incredible amount of car for the money. The thing is that the first few years of production for the KN took place during Porsche's economy phase. They decided that after many years of making Teutonic cars, very well built, good components, good materials, they weren't really making enough money. And to be fair, they did almost go bankrupt a couple of times. So from 2000 onwards, the late 90s onwards, with the 996, with the Boxster, they started doing things a little bit differently. Now, some of these cars suffered more than others, and these early KNs are some of the worst affected. So much so that there are dealers I know who simply refuse to stock them because they are too much trouble. Let me give you some examples of the running costs. So of course, again, fuel consumption is an issue with these. 15 miles to the gallon is pretty common for a turbo. The V8 engines are probably the worst of all. They suffered, again, catastrophic failure from the Locozil coating, which would fail. Later cars, I think 2007 and onwards, don't have this issue, but the earlier cars did. They suffer from a myriad of coolant leaks. On some models, one of the coolant pipes was actually held in place with glue. Obviously, over time, with heat cycles, that fails and it starts to leak. There are other issues as well with failing thermostats, the drains for the sunroof that tend to block and the car will fill up with water. The drive shaft support bearings fail after just 60,000 miles. Another well-known weak point for these cars is the finicky air suspension. By now, it's controlled by a really dated old computer, and inevitably, there will be issues with the wiring. When that happens, the computer may need to be replaced, or worse, the whole harness. Both issues can cost thousands of pounds to sort out. So these three cars are ones that are truly dangerous for people like me and you. They are relatively affordable. The next two cars that I'm going to talk to you about, luckily, average Joes like me and you, there is absolutely no chance that we're ever going to own one of these. But they are interesting nonetheless, because some of the prices of even the standard maintenance for these two cars vastly exceeds the whole cost of the three cars that I've just spoken to you about. So the first example that I want to give you is the Bugatti Veyron or Chiron. I think the costs are pretty similar between the two. So new, it retails for $2.9 million. It is the fastest car in the world, 304 miles an hour. And are you ready for this? An oil change for this car costs £25,000. How is that possible? An oil change, a very minor service. On any standard car, it's about £200–300, and even that's a bit of a rip-off. So, undoubtedly, I know it's a very complex engine. Apparently, it has 15 different drain holes. So I know there's about 25 hours labour involved in it. But still, it does make you realise these hypercars, how incredibly expensive they are to maintain. The last car I want to talk to you about is the McLaren F1, and this really is a doozy. It's not a current car, it was out in the 90s, but it is an absolute legend. To buy one now, you'd have to pay about $20 million. It was for a long time the fastest car in the world, 234 miles per hour. It's an incredible design, and it has some eye-watering costs. Let me give you just a couple of examples, because I think that's all we need. If you need some new tyres for your F1, they are specific, specially made by Michelin. The cost to replace them? $40,000. How on earth is it possible, $40,000? Well, if I break it down, it will make a bit more sense. It's no less ridiculous, but you can kind of begin to understand that price. When McLaren do the replacement for the tyres, they don't just take the wheels off, put some new tyres on, balance them, and away you go. The cost of the tyres themselves almost seems reasonable at $7,000 for these bespoke tyres. But the rest of the cost is made up by the fact that when McLaren do this, they do this on a track. So they hire out a track, they hire out a driver, there's specialist insurance, and that's where that monumental cost comes from. All the same, I really don't understand why they can't just do it in a normal way in a normal garage, why the car has to be tested on a track. Presumably there is some reason to it, but still. Another example, this car has fuel cells. So like the F40, instead of a solid fuel tank, possibly because of where they're located, they are essentially bags that carry fuel. They have a lifespan of just 5 years. So every 5 years, whether you're using the F1 or not, you have to replace them. The cost for a replacement? $80,000. $80,000. You could get several nice cars for that. It's just incredible. But to top it all off, I'm going to show you, I'm going to give you an example of what can happen when you crash a car like this. One of these F1s was owned from new by Rowan Atkinson, who's a British institution. Most of you will probably know him as Mr. Bean, but he is also a really avid, passionate sports car driver or car enthusiast. He had an F1 and he drove it. To his credit, he put loads of miles on it. Unfortunately, a few years back, he did have a spin and he crashed it. The cost to fix it? As you can see, there's a fair amount of damage. But the cost to fix it? So the cost of the estimate alone, so that was McLaren going in, taking it apart, finding out what it needed, working it out, it's supposed to be £35,000 for the estimate. The overall cost of fixing the car? £910,000. Now luckily for Rowan, when it came to selling the car, I think they were about $1 million, $1.5 million new. When it came to selling it, he was still, firstly, the insurance covered the cost of this. Secondly, when he sold it, he was still able to sell it a few years back for about £9 million. So he still made a profit. Maybe that's the lesson for us. Don't buy the really cheap stuff, buy the really expensive stuff and come out on top. Obviously, most of us can't do that. Thank you all so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Please do subscribe if you can. If you are interested in any of these different blogs, videos that I'm doing like this, if you have any ideas, please put them in the comments. I can do some research, do another video blog. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Look forward to seeing you for the next one.